In the late afternoon of Thursday, in a New York City courtroom, Donald Trump became the first president in American history to be convicted of a crime. He also became the first presumptive major party nominee to become a convicted felon. The 12-person jury handed down their guilty verdict, deciding Donald Trump did in fact try to influence the 2016 presidential election when he falsified his business records to pay hush money to porn star Stormy Daniels in order to silence her over their alleged sexual affair. While paying hush money to Miss Daniels is not a crime, Donald Trump had been accused of covering up the $130,000 payment before running in the 2016 election, which he then went on to win. So what's next? Joining me now to discuss this historical moment for the United States is criminal defence lawyer Nick Freeman. Nick, Trump, the first ever president to be convicted of a crime. How significant is this?
It's history in the making. It's going to have a huge effect on the forthcoming election, the presidential election, and it's going to be even more polarising, dependent upon what the judge decides to do with him. During the trial, I think it's important to remember he and the judge didn't get on. Trump showed scant disrespect for the court. He breached the gagging order repeatedly. So it's quite clear that the judge doesn't like him. I think it's also quite clear that the judge was keen to ensure justice, but was hungry for a conviction. He wasn't going to be bought. He wasn't going to accept any delays. He wanted the matter to proceed. And unusually, he did say to the jury when he asked them to retire, if you convict, it will not necessarily result in a custodial sentence. So he's been convicted of 34 counts of business record falsification. They carry a maximum sentence of 4 years. But he's 77. He's a man of good character. Obviously, he's held high office. He may hold high office again, who knows? The interesting thing is he cannot grant himself a presidential pardon because this was a state conviction, not a federal conviction. But if he were to be sentenced to a period in prison, which I think is unlikely, then, and he became president, he would be able to successfully argue that he can't actually do his day job, which is a 24/7 job, and therefore he would be released from custody. He may actually decide that he should be detained at home, and he makes a home detention order coupled with other things. We don't know, but I think incarceration is extremely unlikely. And if it were to be incarceration, it would be suspended pending an appeal.
He has now been convicted, and as you said, it's unlikely he will face jail time, but his sentencing is in over a month, in July 13. Do you think he will have any sort of punishment, whether that means he is sentenced to jail, whether it's a few months, whether he's given an ankle monitor and he's on house arrest, whether he's has to do some sort of public service, whether that be picking up trash? Or do you genuinely think that someone of the former president, even though he's convicted of a crime, will get off scot-free?
He definitely will not get off scot-free. I mean, I'd just like to make a comment. The jury was quite a highbrow jury. Unusually, the jury consisted of 2 lawyers, a lot of tech people, a teacher, and an investment banker. So I think the level of IQ of the jurors was unusually high. But he certainly won't get off scot-free. The judge will obviously have in mind the implications of any sentence he gives him in terms of the vote as to whether he's going to be president. And the judge will not want to antagonize or even try and influence the situation. Because if, for example, he were to send him to prison, and as I've already said, there's a 90% chance for offences like this that you don't go to prison, that would probably evoke huge sympathy and may well, ironically, ensure that Trump is elected as the next president. Now, I can't see that the judge would impose a sentence of litter picking or some other form of community penalty for that very reason. He's a very special man, and he will have to be afforded preferential special treatment because of who he is, because of the security risk about him, and he could very soon be again the most powerful man in the world. So the judge has to walk a tightrope. I'd go for a financial penalty, possibly coupled with house arrest for a period of time, or a sort of period of time where he has to remain at home. He's allowed out at a certain time, but back, a sort of curfew to enable him to get on and do his daytime job.
Nick, it should be pointed out that even if he does get jail time, he can still run for president. He could be the president from a jail cell. There's no rules to stop a felon in jail from actually running in the highest job in the world. You say that he could be given a financial penalty. He has to pay off a large sum to the courts. Hilariously, he's already been raising so much money, though, Nick. He might not even have to take any money out of his own pocket. He could have his constituents be raising this money already.
I think he'd have a huge problem if he used the funds for the election and diverted those funds towards paying off any financial penalty imposed by the court.
You could get a GoFundMe.
I'm sure his lawyers will be strongly advising against going that route, because I think we'll see him back in court very soon, and I think the key will be thrown away. So I don't think he's going to go down that route now. I think he's not going to go to prison. It would be wrong on every count, and I think it would literally ensure his place in the White House next after the election. And the judge won't want to do that. On the
note of how this will affect Trump's campaign, you said before that this actually might boost his popularity. A lot of people think that his polling numbers will go up. How do you think his guilty verdict will help or hinder his campaign?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think to some extent it depends on what the judge does with him. If in any way he's seen as a martyr, if any way that he's seen if the judge is overzealous in his sentencing with him, I think that will get him more votes rather than less votes, and the judge will not want to be involved in that. So I think prison will put him back in the White House. I think the public won't like the fact that he's now being convicted. He's proven to be dishonest. He's proven basically to have committed fraud. There are other charges that, of course, remain outstanding. Serious charges, which will probably go away if he becomes president. He has a really difficult task ahead of him, the judge, in the sense that he just won't want to influence what happens. It's a real hard one to call because he's such a polarizing figure, and he literally has 50% of people with him and 50% behind him. I think most right-thinking people would say it's wrong to put somebody with a criminal record back in that seat. But I think if he gets custody, the general public will think he actually is being picked upon. This was an unfair prosecution. It's been selected to be dealt with at this time to jeopardize his chances of getting back in the seat. And ironically, that will actually put him back in the seat.
And we obviously saw his reaction outside the courtroom saying it was rigged. He was obviously unhappy. He knows exactly how to get his voters, his MAGA supporters, listening to what he has to say. But for the last few years, Nick, there has been this huge narrative surrounding Republican voters and Republican Party members who think the US justice system is rigged, it's broken, it's in favour of the left. It's not just the DOJ, it's the FBI, it's any big, big area that the US voters, rely on. They think that the United States has just become a feeding ground for the left, and that the right wing and the middle class are left out. But how do you think that this conviction, this guilty conviction, will feed into that already big narrative?
I think there's a disenfranchisement with politicians generally across the world. There is in America, there is in this country. There's so much corruption, the sort of contamination of good ideas. And I think people generally have just lost faith in politicians. And this conviction in itself may endorse that view. People who might have been inclined to vote for Trump might now well say to themselves, look, I'm not prepared to do this now. I've heard people say he's dishonest. I've heard people suggest these things that are not wholesome about him, but I've now, having followed this trial, listened to the evidence, believe that actually he's not a wholesome man. He doesn't have the sort of good qualities that we want for the leader of the world. But as I say, generally, politicians are not doing well at the moment. And I think very soon we're going to need a new breed of politicians because people are just, there's an expectation, isn't there, that if you get to the top, you've done something wrong to get there. My view is that per se, they are not going to like having Trump. And I know that he's very polarizing, but they're not going to like having someone who is now a convicted felon. They're not going to like that. Important to bear in mind, he's asking people to vote for him. He can't vote. He doesn't have a vote now because he's a convicted felon.
Yeah,
we shouldn't lose sight.
It is important to note that he can't vote because he's registered in the state of Florida, and Florida doesn't allow felons to vote. So he can't even vote for himself if, we do get to November.
He's asking someone. He's asking everyone to do things he can't do. He's the author of his own misfortune, and there's other stuff around the corner. So, which he will face if he doesn't become president. So his future doesn't look great.
Nick, just finally, even with all of this drama surrounding Trump and whether or not voters will like him more or less after this guilty conviction, and whether Americans in general will look at this saying, I don't want a convicted felon in the White House, but regardless, do you think that Donald Trump was politically motivated, politically targeted, I should say?
I think the timing is interesting. As I say, people knew what he'd been up to. There are allegations that he still faces. The timing, I think, is interesting. The judge was absolutely adamant that this case was not going to be adjourned till after the election was over. And I suppose you could say full marks for him because he's stuck to his guns and he's thought, if we're going to have somebody who's applying to be president, it's absolutely vital that we know before you put your vote in what type of man you're actually voting for. And I think he should be congratulated on that. I think it's important to the American public when they do come all to vote, they will know actually we're now going to be asked to vote for the highest office in the world for a convicted felon. And I think that, as I say, that will prick moral conscience of many people. So I think that's the situation. I don't think he's done himself any favour with this conviction, and I don't think he's done his future career any favours either. But if the judge goes overboard, then it could have the reverse effect.
Nick Freeman, thank you so much for your time today.